All right. Steve, you should be live. If you want to introduce yourself, and we'll get things started.
I'm Steve Sandifer. I live in Meadows Place, Texas, which is a suburb of Houston. For those of you who are snowed in, it's 79 degrees here right now. And it's been very foggy this morning, but right now it's just overcast. We would like to have some cooler weather. And for those of you who've operated down in the Lone Star region, I understand we lost one of our big operators this morning. Dr. Richard Cam in Shreveport has been reported to have died last night. And his Sioux line hosted lots of our operating sessions and shall be missed. Writer's Office, there were a number of articles 20 years ago about this, and it got me started in studying about less than carload shipping. In the modern world, there are many options for shipping of the new tool or the wedding present or the model. Internet shoppers take for granted FedEx, UPS, Priority Mail. Large shippers use Yellow, Roadway Express, other freight forwarding companies. And all you got to do is get on the freeway for a little while, and you're just surrounded by those trucks that have less than carload, truckload lot freight going across the country. But prior to the mid-20s, the only way to do that was with the railroad. The railroad brought the mail on a daily basis, and with it, the mail order business with Sears, Montgomery Ward, Western Auto, Spiegel, etc. My grandparents' first house full of furniture was delivered by the Spiegel Company in Chicago to the KCS Freight House. LCL freight is defined as freight in one car from more than one shipper or destined to more than one receiver, also known as merchandise service. And when you look in old magazines, you see lots and lots of ads for LCL service. It was a big deal. Why LCL is big business on the Pensy. Well, there were three primary shipping options in the first half of the 20th century. They were the U.S. Postal Service, Railway Express, and railway less than carload lot shipping. Freight forwarders were independent LCL shippers who also used the rail. REA was owned jointly by the railroads and provided premium express service on passenger trains. Parcel Post went by passenger train as well, but was primarily for smaller packages. Parcel Post began in 1913, but was limited to 11 pounds and 72-inch combined length and width. It was expanded to 70 pounds in 1931, but size limit remained. So the only way to ship anything of size was to ship it LCL. And there would be a spot at the local depot or the freight house for you to ship your items. LCL freight could consist of just about anything, from a box of cigars to an old mule, bicycles, stoves, farm machinery, barbed wire, canned foods, complete households could be found in the same car. It was also called by some railroads a way car. Freight came from private individuals as well as companies. It might arrive at the freight house in a wagon, a car, a private truck, trucking company truck, railroad vehicle. Railroads began offering local pickup service in the 1930s. The pages you're looking at come from the AAR loading rules for mixed freight in-house cars. R.M. Neal is quoted really in an early dispatcher's office describing the contents of a way car on the B&M Hillsboro branch in 1949. A wheelbarrow going to Hillsboro, some gallon cans of Sears Roebuck paint in transit to Antrim, We have 2 boxes of General Electric light bulbs, other boxes of Kleenex, a carton of crepe paper, Halloween cups from the C.A. Reed Company of Williamsport, Pennsylvania is part of the freight. Plumber's equipment for John J. Carey is in one corner of the boxcar. Near the door are cans of poultry feed. A box of Hallmark greeting cards is in the car. We're carrying garden hose, tools. Spiegel Mail Order House in Chicago has given us a shipment of small furniture, crated. A Montgomery Ward canoe is another of our items. You would also expect to see items for the railroad company store in there. In 1921, 28% of all car loadings were LCL freight. That number topped out at 32% in 1932. 1/3 of all car loadings. In 1940, it was 21%. 1945, 13%. 1950, 11%. 1955, 8.5%. And by 1959, 6.8%. As highways were improved, more LCL freight moved to the roads. Most of the rail cars in the transition era were 40-foot boxcars, though others, especially reefers, were also used. Since boxcars made up 40% of the national fleet, 11% of car loadings, 1950, equaled 27% of all boxcars on the rails in 1950. So you can see LCL freight was a very high volume item that can't be ignored, but many of us really have. By the late 60s, early 70s, LCL came to a halt. Santa Fe officially removed the service from its railroad in 1972. As an example, I have recently transcribed a conductor's record book from 1922 in Kansas. This was between Great Bend and Newton, Kansas. The record book shows 1,088 total cars, 690 were loads, 398 were empties, 409 were box cars or auto box cars, 228 reefers, etc. But notice, 122 were merchandise cars. Out of 690 loads, 122 were LCL cars. 21 going east, 101 going west. This shows that most of the manufacturing was on the East Coast, and so these shipments were going to the westward destinations. All freight systems operated with the same general method that's still used today by shipping firms. I have a son who works for UPS. I had a son who was a dispatcher for Roadway Express. I learned a lot from them because they do a lot of things the very same way today, just faster. Each city, regardless of size, would have a shipping point and a delivery office, primarily at the depot. Large cities like Chicago or New York would have several major freight terminals. With various railroads serving the same community, each railroad would have its own freight terminal. At points along each railroad, there'd be major hubs or transfer freight houses where shipments from across the system were broken down, reloaded, and sent on their way for delivery or interchange. In large cities, it was often necessary to ferry freight from one railroad freight house to that of another, either by rail or by truck. Larger railroads would have several transload houses. If quantities justified it, freight could bypass one transload facility as it headed for another. An example is the Santa Fe, which had major transload facilities at Corwith Yard in Chicago, Kansas City, Albuquerque, and Los Angeles. Corwith Yard had several LCL cars a day that were headed for Los Angeles, and they didn't need to stop anywhere else along the way. Transload facilities were also where freight would be moved to another railroad. For instance, LCL moving from Los Angeles to New York might go to the Kansas City transload, and from there by the mop to St. Louis to move on to the Pennsy for New York. Or it might move to Chicago for transfer to the New York Central, the Wabash, or the Erie. An example was given by Tim Gilbert in an earlier dispatcher's office for a shipment from Needles, California to Portland, Maine. From Needles, the local office, it would go to Flagstaff, a regional office, and then on to the transfer house at Albuquerque. They would ship it to Chicago and Gibson Transfer on the Illinois Harbor Belt in Chicago. And then to a New York Central car to Utica Transfer. At Utica, the New York Central would move it to Mechanicsville, New York, for the Boston and Maine to take it to Portland, Maine. Needless to say, it took a while for all of that to happen, and the package was handled many times. This photo will illustrate the scope of LCL movements. This is the Southern Railroad's yards and shops at Spencer, North Carolina. If you can see it, the part up at the top is where the roundhouse and shops were located, and this is the current North Carolina Museum of Transportation that some of us have been able to visit. Down in the middle here is the feedwater rest station for livestock. But what we're really interested in today is all of this at the bottom. That is the LCL transload facility. Each evening, well over 200 cars would be pulled from this facility, and by noon the next day would be replaced with 200 more for transfer. Now, if you've been to Spencer, you know it's not near a major city. It's 60 miles north of Charlotte. It's about 120 miles from Raleigh-Durham, but it's halfway between Washington and Atlanta in the middle of the Southern network. So cars from all over the Southern system came there every night for complete unloading and reloading of LCL freight. The significance of that shouldn't be missed. Railroads published detailed schedules that told the deadlines for shipping to various points and how those cars would be routed. This is a page from the Santa Fe schedule for rail deliveries from San Bernardino, 1946. The blocks are for rail movement. Down at the bottom you see R. Those are for runs by trucks, and those were to areas that were very close to San Bernardino. In 1951, the New York Central schedules included 1,807 routes. Utica Transfer, Utica, New York, originated 114 routes, 76 to New York Central locations, and 38 to offline locations. In addition, 125 routes terminated at Utica. These included 86 from the New York Central and 39 from offline roads. Routes could be annulled if insufficient freight was available, and multiple cars could be used on the same route if freight justified it. Unscheduled cars could be added as well, such as at the Christmas season, which was always a rush time. At Christmas, the New York Central might add cars for Los Angeles, for instance, out of Utica, and those cars could bypass all the freight houses along the way. Most LCL cars only contain 5 to 8 tons of merchandise. A 10-ton minimum was required to operate merchandise cars during World War II, but normally they had less. At some points, they could delay the cars or the shipment up to 36 hours if they didn't have 10 tons available. But that really messed up their shipping out of the freight house, as we'll see in a minute. Most cars might cube out before they weighed out. In other words, the boxes and all of that would take up more space, and there was plenty of weight left in the car. But generally speaking, they were not full except at Christmas time. Most business was conducted during daylight hours, and so the freight houses would receive packages until a predetermined closing time for the destinations, usually the end of the workday. Then the cars for that location were closed, pulled, and sent on their way through the night in anticipation of a morning delivery the next day. If it was going to a hub, the contents would be worked the next day for another night train hop across the country. So most of your LCL freight moved at night. An example is the New York Central Pacemaker service that left New York City at 7 p.m. It arrived in Albany at midnight, Utica transfer at 2 a.m., and Buffalo by 7 a.m. Very few lines ran dedicated merchandise trains, but merchandise cars did receive red ball priority. Trains like the New York Central, with a heavy population like New York City, could run dedicated LCL trains. At a freight house, cars were brought in from a variety of points of origin. They arrived all night and in the early morning and were spotted at the freight house, frequently 2 and 3 or more deep, with their doors linked together as a hallway between the cars. They did not mix 40-foot and 50-foot cars, as that messed up those spots. Each spot was designated for one destination, and it was always the same at that spot, regardless of the cars parked there. So the freight crews knew exactly where to put freight for a given destination. Those doors were also arranged in order for correct blocking of the cars, so that when the track was pulled, you didn't have to re-switch the cars before you sent them on their way. Once a car was spotted, its next destination was set by its spot, and the cars were generally not pulled until they were ready to go at the end of the day. An exception would be at larger terminals where cars from major destinations pulled at several scheduled times, or at terminals that had separate inbound and outbound track from the middle of the house.
Hey, Steve.
With all the cars linked by bridges and being loaded at once.
Steve, sorry to interrupt you. Your audio is sort of breaking up a little bit. You might want to try turning off your video. Your screen will still share, it just won't take the bandwidth up for your photo for right now.
All right, does that work?
Right. Yeah, let's try that. Like I said, you were just breaking up there for a little bit. But
okay.
Go ahead.
This is another picture of that Spencer shops, or the Spencer transload. You'll notice there are cars parked exactly apart from each other, across from each other. There are 8 cars, and then there's a break. There's 8 cars, and then there's a break. The reason for that is there are portable bridges that were placed through here. We'll see that in a minute. Just for kicks, we'll assume that these 4 cars are going to Washington. And down here we have 4 cars that are going to Atlanta. When these cars came in, and they would probably be the first ones in because they're the furthest in, they would be immediately unloaded and the stuff would be taken up here to the top where the Washington cars would be, whether the Washington cars had arrived or not, because they knew that's where the Washington cars would be. You see, every single spot was predetermined where it was going. This is why it became very difficult to, for instance, use the routing rules of sending a car toward its home base. If the car that ended up being spotted here was from who knows where, it's going to Washington because it's in the Washington spot regardless. Let's see, this is that portable bridge in Spencer. So you can see you didn't just pull cars out of the yard, because once it was set up, you had to work them all. And then this is looking down the dock, and every car door had a number or a name on it, so they knew this is where their destination was going to be. If a car arrived with its primary shipments going to a distant location and those were very heavy, it might be spotted with that in mind or spotted elsewhere. For instance, you shipped cars, you shipped tractors, you shipped heavy machinery. There might be a car loaded with paper goods. So those would be treated differently. But you had a mixture of home road cars and foreign cars, and that you just put them where you could. D.K. Spencer worked for the Santa Fe. He handled lots of LCL, and he talks about any weight from 1 pound to several thousand pounds could be moved as LCL. And the rates were based on a minimum of 100-pound shipment. At his Lamar, Colorado depot, there was a typical dock, which was the same height as the floor of the boxcar, 3'6" over the rail. The open space between the dock and the car was bridged by a large steel plate about a ½ inch thick and 36 to 40 inches wide, with a bent lip at one end. They were extremely heavy. Mr. Spencer has a page on the Santa Fe website that describes some of his memorable LCL shipments. For instance, 600-pound barrels of molasses, bundles of green hides, 400-pound bags of wool, bundles of mail order catalogs, sheet metal, and once a 2,500-pound crate of plate glass. They had no forklifts. Shipment was generally loaded and unloaded by manpower. Missouri Pacific in 1949 developed speed boxes, metal containers on casters for carrying smaller LCL packages. These range from 42 to 74 cubic feet in size, with up to a 1,200-pound capacity. Several railroads produce merchandise cars equipped with internal racks and restraints and painted them to advertise their service. The B&O had their time saver service in 1951. The pacemaker service was 1946. SP had their overnights on the West Coast. Missouri Pacific had their Eagle merchandise service. Pennsy had their merchandise service. When originally designed, all of these wanted to keep their cars on the home rails to advertise their services. Missouri Pacific had it clearly written for merchandise loading only between Missouri Pacific and TP freight stations. Do not interchange with other lines. But this didn't last very long because you noted how difficult it would be at a freight house to spot those cars where they would be going back to home road destinations. It just didn't work. You likewise would not expect to see one of these cars at a grain elevator, for instance, in grain service, nor would you see them on a passenger train in express service. They didn't have steam lines. They didn't have the corner marker brackets. These were for LCL shipments, not express and not usually general service. Trap cars. Manufacturers who produced furniture, appliances, clothing, candy, processed foods, and mail order companies like Sears, Montgomery Ward, Western Auto produced large quantities of LCL freight. And they would load their individual shipment into trap cars, as they would call them, box cars, which could be moved directly to a railroad's major transfer house, avoiding time-consuming trips to a local freight house. For instance, Tootsie Roll Factory in Hoboken, New Jersey, routinely ran a sweets car from their factory to New York Central Transfer at Utica, where it was broken up into LCL for further distribution. Montgomery Ward might load 20 cars with LCL at their Chicago warehouse and send them to various transload centers around the country where the LCL would be removed and routed to further delivery. Railroads were allowed to substitute 2 reefers for 1 boxcar. LCL shippers liked that for trap cars because it allowed them to be more specific in their routing, bypassing intervening freight houses and offering faster delivery. Let's go back to this slide. I said that in 1923 conductor's record, 122 cars were in merchandise service. What I didn't say back then was that 45 of those cars were reefers and 77 were boxcars. The reefers were all headed westbound. Most reefers in revenue traveled from west to east, south to north, while most of the manufacturing was the opposite direction. The use of reefers for LCL service was a great way to make some revenue on cars that normally traveled back to the growing fields empty. Since most LCL cars did not cube out, the smaller capacity of a reefer was fine for LCL. On the Santa Fe, LCL was frequently in a reefer in front of the caboose or combine, especially in the off-season. This photo shows a reefer in LCL service on the Santa Fe Howard branch at Eureka, Kansas, 1947. According to James Burke, who took the photo, it was a very common occurrence. And in the records of 1923 that I transcribed, you could see this a number of times where a Santa Fe reefer was in front of the combine in LCL service. You say, but why not put the LCL in the combine? Well, the combine didn't fit at the freight house. It wasn't 40 foot. And so it was easier to put the LCL in the reefer and pick it up and put it in front of the combine than it was to transfer it to the combine itself. Reefers also were operated in LCL service to deliver perishable products to merchants along their branch lines. You'll see at least 3 reefers in this Santa Fe, Emporia, Kansas freight house scene. This may have been during grain season. You'll see there's one here, one there, another one here. During grain season, every boxcar was needed to haul the grain, and so reefers would stand in LCL service. But this was not without some compromises. The floor of a reefer was 14 inches higher because of all the insulation in the floor. Therefore, loaders had to push heavy LCL up a ramp 14 inches to get it into the car. And unloading a heavy object was not without its risks either. Also, the opening of most reefers was 4 foot. Santa Fe standard was 5 foot. But this is still tighter than the 6 foot on most boxcars during the transition period. In 1952, Santa Fe opened a new freight depot at Corwith Yard, Chicago. The freight house featured 6 tracks, all inside a closed building, with a capacity of 156 cars, 26 cars per track. One track was constructed 7 inches lower than the others to accommodate reefers. The recessed track was a compromise to allow loading both boxcars and reefers with equal inconvenience, either 7 inches up or 7 inches down. A tow-veyor system operated on an endless cable, pulling 340 baggage carts around the complex to move freight from one side to the other. In addition, this facility had 70 inbound and 50 outbound highway truck docks. Santa Fe served 3 other freight houses in Corwith. House number 1 handled national car loading traffic. House number 2, Republic car loading traffic. And house number 3, New Crest, a division of Chicago Furniture Forwarders. Combined, they held 392 cars. So 392 cars a day going out of these 4 freight houses. In 1946, Corwith Transfer sent out LCL to 66 different locations on the system. These were regional as well as local freight offices, plus interchanges to other railroads, and you'll see the list here. Nerska, by the way, is only 2 miles away. Joliet was 31 miles away. A dry reefer went to Kansas City for candy during the warm months, and it was heated for glass-packed and canned goods during the winter. A car was always scheduled for company materials for Topeka store, and another reefer was scheduled for other perishable freight to Kansas City. 2 trains, number 37 and 39, carried the bulk of LCL cars west from Corwith. 39 ran straight to Kansas City with LCL for Kansas City and beyond. 37 served the communities between Chicago and Kansas City on its way to Kansas City. In 1959, Santa Fe built a new freight house and terminal office building on the north side of the Argentine yard. You'll notice there's 7 tracks going into the building. Bob Waltz has written a book on Santa Fe freight houses, published by Paired Rail. This is the side view, which shows the trucking ramps along both sides and the cranes on 2 stub tracks. Inside, they use the same tow-veyor system to circulate cars through the facility. Can you spot the reefer? All cars can be loaded inside, out of any problems of the weather, and again, one track is 7 inches lower than the rest to accommodate reefer loading. Kansas City Freight Office loaded twice as many as Corwith. This is a 1953 record that shows the various interchange going to other railroads. In 1946, Train 37 brought LCL from Corwith and continued south to Galveston. 33 carried LCL to the southwest and west coast. 35 west coast to Denver, or west to Denver. And all 3 dropped off LCL at intermediate points. 38 went east to Corwith and intermediate locations, and 69 took LCL to Tulsa and southern Kansas. Kansas City also originated 21 Santa Fe transportation truck routes. This is an earlier view, 1884, or of the 1884 freight house. This is the 1920s. It was built in the bottoms. Here's a map of the bottoms of Kansas City. You'll notice this 1/2 mile circle. And inside that circle, there are 12 freight houses. The Chicago Great Western, Kansas City Southern, over here's the Mopac, the Wabash, UP, Burlington, the Alton, Frisco, Rock Island, Katy, Milwaukee, and Santa Fe, all within that 1/2 mile diameter circle. Now, this has been turned 90 degrees. North is over here to your right. But you can see UP has an inbound and an outbound freight house. Santa Fe has an inbound and an outbound. Burlington has an inbound and an outbound. And they're all just down there bunched together in the bottoms. Again, inbound and outbound for the Santa Fe, with numerous parallel tracks. Most shipments start and end at the local depot. So if you have a branch line operation, don't forget to send the caboose or the LCL car by the depot or freight house to pick up any loads to be dropped off at the station down the line. Include instructions to your crew concerning where to stop and the time to allow for loading and unloading. A report in the War Bonnet of the Santa Fe Society back in March of '01 showed a Central of New Jersey boxcar in front of the caboose serving as an LCL car for the San Saba, Texas branch of the Santa Fe. The train was delayed for 50 minutes, 20 minutes, and 20 minutes to handle LCL loads at 3 different stations. The entire train crew might be needed to assist with that. So you might factor that into a trip if you want to be prototypical. Tell your crew they need to stop for X amount of time to unload LCL at certain locations. This photo, James Burke photo, is of Eureka, Kansas, and you can see the Santa Fe Trail transportation truck making a stop while meeting train 95, which is headed north to Emporia. You may be unloading into a truck bed at a grade crossing. I have reports of prize racehorse and grand champion hogs being unloaded from an REA car in a passenger train in this same fashion in the middle of a street. One case was the Santa Fe Fast Mail, which was an extremely tightly scheduled train unloading a hog in the middle of Kansas. For the modeler, the LCL car and caboose could be spotted at the house track or dock while the engine crew does the rest of your switching, and then they could come back and get it before they leave, assuming your local town has space for that. This brings me to the Santa Fe Trail transportation. Santa Fe purchased the Southern Kansas stage lines in 1936, moving the rail into the trucking and bus business. Headquartered in Wichita, the Santa Fe Trail Transportation Company was begun. From this time on, initially in Kansas, the Santa Fe began coordinating rail truck handling of LCL freight. By 1946, the majority of delivery schedules are noted as coordinated rail truck service. This was true for virtually all small towns in Kansas, such as Abilene, Ark City, Atchison, Wellington, or mainline locations like Trinidad or Raton. All service to Denver, El Paso, Topeka, Tulsa, and Wichita had become coordinated rail truck by 1946. My thanks to Classic Metalworks for giving us this paint scheme. I purchased on eBay a company file comparing LCL shipments in March 1939 with March 1945. It shows the benefits of combined rail truck LCL, and everything was based on St. Joe up here in the corner. St. Joe was a minor freight house, which in 1939 shipped 7 merchandise rail cars daily to 7 other freight houses marked in yellow on this map. A total of 218 cars were shipped in the month of March 1939. In March 1945, that number had reduced from 218 to 10. Due to the use of Santa Fe Trail transportation trucks. In addition, virtually every destination had a speed increase of 1 day. One of the examples that was given in this report was Emporia, Kansas, which I am modeling. In 1939, Emporia was the regional hub and provided LCL to all of these lines marked in the salmon color. Merchandise for the area served by Emporia would leave St. Joe in the evening, arrive the first morning in Emporia, then it was sorted, providing second-day delivery to many. However, since some of these branch lines only ran Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, up and back kind of schedules, that meant their car might sit for a day before it ever moved to make a delivery. it took 3 days to deliver items the 150 miles from St. Joe to Concordia, for instance. By 1945, nearly all traffic out of St. Joe was handled by truck. 155 of the 177 routes had 1-day improvement in delivery. 15 had a 2-day improvement. Only 7 saw no improvement with the use of coordinated rail truck shipments. So they would use this yellow to haul it, for instance, from St. Joe to Abilene, where it would be put on daily mixed trains that would serve the rest of this branch. Likewise, it would get over here for the Galatia branch. Jared Harper, some of you know, models the Alma branch, and he reports, here's how it's done on the Alma branch in Kansas in the 1940s. The motor car or the coach baggage and caboose car would be spotted at the depot in the morning, where the Santa Fe Trailways truck on a Topeka Emporia route would back up to the baggage door and unload the LCL from the previous day and load the LCL for the branch for that day. The depot agent handled the paperwork. There was also Railway Express shipments. Railway Express was managed by the Railway Express Agency. It was expedited service, and items shipped by Railway Express came by passenger train and were dropped at the Burlingame Depot. The depot agent also handled the paperwork for the REA, and they were loaded in the baggage compartment with the LCL. REA paid the railroad to handle their shipments. U.S. mail was also loaded in the baggage compartment, and the post office paid the railroad to handle this. Large pieces of personal baggage could also go in the baggage compartment. After everything was ready to go to the Alma branch, mixed train went up the branch, dropping off and picking up LCL, express mail, passengers, and perhaps their personal baggage. The head-end brakeman was in charge of making sure all the LCL, express, and mail was dropped off or picked up. He got a separate monthly check from the express company for his duties. When the train got back to the depot in Burlington, the express and mail were unloaded at the depot. The LCL stayed in the baggage compartment to be picked up by the Santa Fe Trailways truck the next morning, which would be taken then to Topeka, and its route was complete. The express and mail would be put on the next passenger train going the direction the express or mail was headed. Emporia's freight house was typical of mid-size houses. Emporia in the 50s had 15,000 residents, a small town. The head house was the office portion. Behind it was the freight platform, and part of it was open and part of it was closed. This was not designed to store items long term. It was relatively narrow with large doors on both sides, and the rear portion was open. On one side, there were parallel tracks where LCL cars would be parked. Emporia had 2 tracks, an open platform, and 2 more tracks. On the other side of the house is where all the trucks backed up. Since my interest is Emporia in the early 50s, I'll focus on the cars sent to this location in 1946. Remember, it's a town of 15,000. And coordinated rail truck is already in process. 5 LCL cars arrived each day, 1 from Chicago, 4 from Kansas City. One of the ones from Kansas City was a reefer for perishable loads. Cargo for Emporia coming from the distant west went through Emporia, didn't stop, went to Kansas City transfer, and then was brought back to Emporia from Kansas City transfer. Closer towns had their freight sent to Wichita and delivered by truck. Santa Fe Trail Transportation handled inbound truck shipments from Topeka and Wichita and everything else leaving Emporia. Shipments leaving Emporia by rail included the first block was a train, a local that went between Argentine and Emporia, going from Argentina to Emporia Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then back Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, and it took LCL along its way. There was one that went from Strong City to Osborne, another one that went from Saffordville, just outside of Emporia, to Osborne on Wednesdays only, and then the 96, which I modeled, that went from Olpe to Moline, the Howard branch. LCL stock cars were also operated on branch lines to handle small shipments of livestock from small towns to auction houses in larger communities. Stock loaded into these cars would be partitioned or tied from one another. Partitioning was safer with bulls being tied. It was not unusual to find different kinds of stock in the same peddler stock car. The Santa Fe had 10 cars from their SKR class, which had small side doors in addition to the normal stock car door, and also had internal movable partitions to help in this kind of service. Again, this ceased as highways improved and trucks were far more reliable and faster at getting the stock to the auctions. Ferry cars were used to move freight from the railroad's freight house to that in another town. Usually this was handled more effectively by truck, but in the early days, nearly all of it was rail served. And don't forget the ports. This is the combined Galveston-Henderson, Houston-Henderson, IGN, MKT freight house, which still stands in Galveston, Texas. There was no transfer to other railroads. This was transfer from the railroads to ships. On the side that we're looking at here, there were 5 parallel tracks, and that is quite a long freight house. The other side was for trucks to take the freight to the ships. Stop-off cars were not technically LCL cars, so I want to get that straight. Stop-off cars were cars that an industry would load, but it might have several destinations. For instance, International Harvester might load 6 tractors on a flat car, and they want 3 to go to one dealer and 3 to go to another dealer somewhere else. The same happened with lumber, appliances. Since those were shipped from the shipper to the consignee, they would not be considered LCL cars. You also had meat packers who did route cars, and technically these were not LCL cars. This is a report on the Chicago Great Western in 1928. Most Mondays, both Swift and Armour cars were loaded in South St. Paul, and they worked certain routes where butchers would meet the trains at certain times, secure their meat just like you would an LCL shipment, but it was operated in the meat packer's car on a set route and schedule. Trailer on flat car was not begun on the Santa Fe until 1951, when 2 flats were experimentally converted to handle trailers. It would be later in the 50s before piggyback service was a reality on the Santa Fe. Modeling LCL, well, you need freight houses. Both of these were built by my friend Bob Barnett, who used to be in Houston, now in Navasota, and they are built from 2 kits combined. I think the kits honestly would be improved if they had 1 kit for the freight house, for the head house, and 2 kits for the dock, because most freight houses had long docks but fairly short offices in the front end. Remember that a freight house was not for storage, it was for transfer. Cars would begin to arrive in the early morning. Most of your cars have arrived by noon. Unloading and reloading cars would continue all day. Around 4:30, you need to close the freight house, and then everything is pulled. It's already been blocked at the freight house, so you can put it directly onto trains and ship it on its way. You can have ferry cars if you have large manufacturing companies. You can load them and take them not to a dealer somewhere, but to the freight house. Maybe you have one town that's larger than the rest, and you can take them from a manufacturing company in one city to the freight house in another, where it would be broken up to ship in other cars. And you can have ferry cars to go from one railroad's freight house to another, especially if you model the 20s, the early times. And I want to stick in a sidebar here. One of the things when I was doing the transcribing of the conductor's record, another thing that we generally don't model very well is company service. In that 690 loads, 133 were company service. That's nearly 20% of that record. Those included coal, oil, sand, ballast, rail, ties, lumber, scrap, cinders, salt, wheels, bunk cars, water cars, and general company supplies. There were 2 stock cars loaded with rail, assumed to be switch parts. So another area you could investigate is using company cars or cars to handle company materials on your railroad. Your railroad itself was probably the biggest industry on your railroad. Santa Fe left the LCL by 1972. All the freight houses were officially retired, and Santa Fe was out of the LCL business. Well, sorta.
All right. We appreciate you presenting, Steve. Got a few questions. Al Dowman's asking, any idea approximately how often a freight house spot designation, number of cars per destination were reassessed? Was it quarterly, annually?
I have not heard, but I know it's done because communities grew, population shifted, but I have not seen anything that said specifically.
Okay. There's a question about what's the relationship between the merchandise shipping and LCL. I think
it's the same.
Yeah, it's the same thing. How was an interchange handled then? Transload from a home road car to the foreign road car?
When you got to a transload facility, nobody cared who owned the car. All you cared about was where it was. If it was at a certain door, it was going to that spot.
Okay.
And so they didn't care if it was a home road car or not, or if it was a foreign road car or not. They just knew that if it was at that door, it was going to that town.
Okay. Somebody mentioned Mopac freight houses had towbayers too. Would the meat packer peddler cars run on the same trains as LCL cars?
I would say yes, because LCL cars ran on any train, really. If they were going between major hubs, they were red ball freight. If they were on a branch line, they were going everywhere the branch line stopped. So most of your meat peddler on your meat route cars, I think, were on branch lines. Someone can correct me on that because I'm not an expert on that. But I think a lot of them were on branch lines or lesser lines, and they were not express as such. They would stop at various communities along the way, and people would pick up their meat.
Okay.
It'd be 2 different cars, but they could be side by side.
Okay. Does this mean that a merchandise train was only LCL cars?
No, rarely.
All right. If a railroad's freight house in the city was large enough to have both an inbound and outbound freight house, was it easier to comply with the car service rules in terms of inbound and outbound tracks?
Yes.
Okay.
And of course, with an inbound, outbound, like the ones I showed in Kansas City, that was not a transfer house. In other words, all the cars that came into the inbound freight house were going to Kansas City. So they would all be unloaded. Those cars would all be empty. And then they would all be available for whatever. But you didn't have stuff come into the inbound house that would then be taken over to the outbound house. That would be at a transfer house instead of city distribution. Does that make sense?
Hold on a second. Let me fix something here. Al, did that question, you can unmute yourself and answer. Did that answer take care of your question, Al Delman?
Yes, it did. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Dave is asking, how did they handle variable numbers of cars if the spots were assigned? If I have 3 spots for Chicago, what did they do if they had business for 5 Chicago cars?
If it's a fluke, they probably load 3 cars and ship them on, and then bring some extra cars in, and some of the stuff is delayed. I don't know how they would handle like a one-day surge that might take place.
Okay. All right. Let's see.
But like on my Emporia, Kansas, it has more cars coming in than are going out. And so every day there will be a couple of cars that
Going back empty somewhere
get
else.
pulled empty.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Dana is asking, how were pay cars handled?
K cars,
Pay cars. Yep.
I am unaware of what a K car is.
Dana, if you want to unmute yourself and ask your question or follow up, feel free.
Yeah, it's pay, like monthly payment.
Oh,
How did the railroad pay itself, and did those? And I'm talking the 1920s, before they could start doing it other ways.
oh my, I do not know. I'm assuming the boxcar would be used just like any standard tariff on use of a boxcar or a reefer. I don't know how shipments were broken up, because many shipments would start on one line and end up on another, and I'm sure they had ways of splitting the cost, just like splitting the cost on the use of a rail car.
Yeah, I don't think I'm making myself clear. I'm talking about the pay package that go to the personnel. It made me think, when you were thinking about how much was railroad, specific railroad related, how did the railroad get its money to its employees, say down branch lines and things like that?
Well, I'm assuming that's through company packets on Railway Express that would be sent to the local agent.
Thanks.
That's an assumption, but it would have nothing to do with LCL shipments. Anything of high value like that would need to be in a REA merchandise. I mean, a REA car with a messenger to secure it.
I see.
All right. Let's see. Were transfer houses generally in smaller towns with cheaper property? be in the big cities with where everybody else was, right?
They're at strategic locations. So Albuquerque, for instance, was close to where the Belen cutoff and the Raton pass line come together with the line that's going south to El Paso and out to Clovis. So it's a strategic location. Kansas City would be a strategic location.
Yep.
Kansas City is, of course, a much larger community than Albuquerque was. But then Spencer, North Carolina on the southern was a small community. It was just in the middle of the southern system.
Good location. So, all right. Let's see if there's any more questions. Did all railroads use LCL?
To my knowledge, you never say all or every when you're talking railroads.
Right. I'm sure there were some that were just dealing with coal that never did LCL
or lumber.
Yeah, or some commodity or something. But,
yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions. If anybody else has any, feel free to. There is a question here about extra cars handled when inbound and outbound routes were unbalanced. The answer to that is the empty cars simply got sent back along with the full ones if need be.
Right.
But I think that's basically it. So, Steve, thank you so much for presenting. Lots of compliments in the chat there on what you presented. For everybody else, we again filled up today. We'll have the replay up on YouTube later tonight. In the meantime, the chat is open and the unmute option is open if anybody has questions or has questions about either what Steve presented or anything else. I'll leave it open for a little bit.
And my thanks to all of those who went before me and got me started on this line. So thank you.
Okay, Travers is saying, sounds like cars were captive service.
They tried it. Those cars that were painted specially, they tried it, but it became a real headache at those freight houses. If you wanted to keep your car on your tracks, it required massive switching at the transload facilities, and it just wasn't practical.
Got it. Seemed like a good idea at the time until they actually put it into, no plan survives contact with the enemy, right?
It was probably conceived in a boardroom with a publicity guy.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, it sounds like, hold on. I think a lot of the NYC pacemakers were in captive service, Ted Deloria says. Where it was practical for a dedicated car was the dedicated cars for a branch. I don't quite follow that. John, if you want to say your question out loud, if you have a microphone, it might be easier to understand. John Barry. It sounds like.
Well, I think I know what he's saying, and I believe it's right, that if you're using, let's say, an old reefer for LCL service on a branch, you can send it down one day, back the next, repack it, and do it again. It could be recycled time after time that way. It would just kind of be stuck to the caboose until you got back and you spotted it at the freight house and put the caboose or combine away, and then tomorrow morning you pick it up and go again.
But in the grand scheme of things, it really wouldn't matter what car it was, as long as
Correct.
they were going to get a car every day. All right.
Hey, Eric, this is Travers.
Go ahead.
What I'm curious about is in the case of unbalanced routes. So Steve mentioned more cars in than out. The excess cars that were not needed for rerouting, were they turned back to the car distributor, or did they go back to constantly being Chicago to Kansas City or whatever destinations they continued to use?
Assuming they were standard box cars, they were just released to be used for anything.
Thank you.
With something like the pacemakers, New York Central had several freight stations in New York City area, and they would haul everything up to Utica transfer, basically. That makes good sense for dedicated cars with dedicated racks inside, and just run them back and forth between New York and Utica. And that makes sense. But on your Western railroads, or Southern railroads, as far as that goes, it just doesn't make sense to do that. And so they just use box cars. A box car is a box car is a box car, as long as it's, of course, here again, you have qualities of box cars. And, a number 10 car, which would be a clean, ready to go car, would be suitable for grain and other things because it's tight. And you've got other cars, the number 1 car might be good for nothing but hides. And so when somebody requested from the car distributor a box car, he didn't just want a box car. He wanted a box car of a certain grade to handle his particular type of merchandise. So you had grades of cars, and I'm assuming they would use good, tight cars for LCL.
So I'm just thinking about a Great Northern car that's in LCL service in Boston on the B&N.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to be rerouted back to Great Northern fairly soon, right?
As soon as it's out of LCL service, yes.
But it could be stuck going back and forth between Boston and New York for years, and they would be paying Great Northern the fee for the use of the car.
Well, there are reports, of cars that left the home road and weren't back for 2 years,
Mm-hmm.
3 years. So,
So what does it mean to be released from LCL service? Would that then go to the car distributor? This car is no longer needed.
yes. So if you have 15 cars coming to a freight house and you only have 12 cars to be shipped out, then you've got 3 cars that get released.
I see. So that right. So the car distributor would definitely want to forward the foreign cars back home any chance they got. They just didn't always get the chance, is what you're saying.
Right.
Okay.
Well, see, I'm assuming that the major source of LCL are your major manufacturing areas. And so, yeah, you get 400 cars a day out of Chicago on the on the Santa Fe, and you may get 400 more out of Chicago on the Burlington, and you may get 200 on the CNNW. I'm just talking here. But eventually they get down to your Eureka, Kansas, or your Podunk centers, and they may have 2 or 3 cars come in and they only need 1 car to go out. And so they're free now. Let them go.
Thanks. This is really enlightening.
It's like that thing I was showing from the 1920s where you had, what was it, 100 cars going west and 20 cars going east. Eventually they balance out.
Steve, I appreciated a couple of images you provided there. One was like the boxcar drawing that showed how some pieces of freight were actually mounted to the sides of the car so that it wouldn't shift around. I mean, like, I think you had an image of a stove that was almost a box was built around it and nailed to the side, and that's it. I mean, the box cars were lined with wood so you could actually nail right to that for securing things. And the other image was the carts being pulled around in the freight houses. It reminded me of what the images we see today, like in Amazon or the delivery services, where everything is conveyors and everything. So in some ways that hasn't changed a whole lot. It's just been upgraded.
Take something like the big FedEx sorting facility there at Indianapolis International, where everything comes in at the same time, everything is sorted and then immediately goes back out. I mean, compared to the, okay, I'm going to relay this from Chicago or from Washington to Baltimore, Baltimore to, you know, Philly, or, you know, I mean, FedEx is kind of, you know, they've taken it a couple steps further. It's amazing. I'd love to see the inside of that, you know, when they're doing the sort, but.
It happens very late at night.
Oh yeah. I was in, one time I flew down to Memphis and I happened to be, it was a very late flight. And I remember looking up and seeing all of the planes stacked up in all the different directions on all of the runways. Just, you know, like every 30 seconds there was a plane landing. And then probably about maybe 4 or 5 in the morning, out they all went. So.
Eric lives just a little bit north of me, and like happy hour in the airline is like about 10 o'clock to midnight over our neighborhoods.
Yep.
I'd like to ask a question, if I may.
The wind is blowing in that direction, so.
I'd like to ask a question, if I may. I'm a little confused about something. On my layout, I have a commercial peninsula where we acquire partial loads. So a car is ordered up and then it's loaded with 3 different manufacturers' items on it. And they're going to go to 3 different places on my layout. They may not go to a centralized transfer building for trucks to get to. I don't have that on my layout. So it makes its first stop. Now, is that car going to stay there overnight until it's unloaded with that first stop's merchandise? And then the next train going in the direction that I've needed to go will pick it up, and that could be 1 or 2 days. And then it goes to the second stop. Again, it's spotted there and then unloaded. But the freight train or the train that it was on is already left. So it could take 3 or 4 days before it to get to its third stop. Am I understanding that correct? Steve?
That does not sound like the LCL that I've been describing.
Yeah, what would that be?
I can answer your question if you like.
Please.
What he is describing is called stop-off cars.
Mm-hmm.
Stop
Okay.
off cars?
Yeah. When I was railroad agent operator. We had stop-off cars. Okay, a car would be loaded by a mostly like where I was feed mills. Feed mill would load a car with bagged animal and poultry feed, and then it would stop at several places to unload that feed because no particular feed mill could take a whole box car of one commodity. So they might load a box car with feed in it for 3 different feed mills. So the car would go be spotted to the first feed mill. They would unload their particular part of the car, close the car doors up. The local agent would reseal the car, and then it would go out to destination number 2. The second feed mill would unload their portion of it. The agent would seal the car back up after they close the doors and release the car, and then it would go to its final destination. And this was done on interchange too. Like one movement I was with Flory Milling Company in Bangor, Pennsylvania, they would interchange the cars to Lehigh and Hudson River Railroad, which would then make several stop-offs after they loaded the car on the Lackawanna.
So does the car move in the same train, or does it stay at the first unloading spot for a day until the next train comes?
It stays till the next train comes. It just moves in local train service. So the local sets it out. The consignee back in those days had 48 hours to unload the car. When he released the car back to the agent, then the agent marked it up for the next local to pick up and forward it on.
Okay.
But if I heard Ron correctly, he's got 3 different companies loading that car,
Yeah, well,
as well as 3 different companies unloading that car.
there was also freight forwarding companies that would consolidate into a single box car shipments from a one town. And these freight forwarding companies normally would send that box car out, and it would go to another terminal of that particular freight forwarding company, and then from there it would be trucked out.
Okay, I'm not using trucks.
Right, I know.
Except to go east. This is a eastern company.
Yeah.
And it's going west. Well, I suppose it could go east too, but it primarily goes west. And to answer Steve's question, I believe my question was drop-offs at 3 different locations. But now that he brings that up, that puts an interesting kink in it. They could also load products for yet a 4th location. So, and I have enough locations on my layout to extend it out to probably 6 or 8 different stops that boxcar could go to. Yeah, this is great because this puts a whole new slant on some operations that I can do. Thank you.
In the case where the inbounds and outbounds are not balanced, and there's more outbounds than inbounds, where does the freight house get the extra cars they need? From the car distributor?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, the number of routes are already set. They're in the documents that the railroad has composed. So your freight distributor is going to know how many cars are needed every day at the freight house. And if you have one more one more run going out than you have coming in, then he knows, put an empty in there every day. And likewise, if he knows you got a surplus, he knows he's going to have extra cars every day.
And the empty could be any railroad.
Yeah.
So I'm getting that the difference between LCL and stop-off car is partly that the shipper or the receiver has got their own loading facilities, their own loading dock, whereas the LCL traffic is all using the company freight houses. Is that right?
Yes.
So if I was a shipper with my own loading dock and I wanted to fill, I only had a half a box car full of stuff. I could send it back to the railroad half full, but I'd just be paying a lot of extra money for that. Right? I couldn't generate an LCL car on my own company loading dock and then put it back into railroad service for LCL.
Yeah. What you're talking about is a trap car. So let's say you have a furniture manufacturer.
Yeah.
You can fill that car up with furniture, send it to the LCL freight house, and then they split it up and ship some here, some there, wherever it's going.
Right. That's a trap car. So if I only have half a car, I'd have to send it to a freight forwarder or somebody to fill the car with something else.
Well, they would probably have their own cars as well.
Yeah. Okay. Boy, this gets complicated. So we got trap cars, we got stop-off cars, and we got LCL cars.
And ferry cars.
And ferry cars. I'm going to write this down. I was hoping not to write anything down, but.
And a route car. You can have a route car with a meat reefer.
Yep.
I have a question now. If you have cars coming in and you have 4 spots allocated to Washington and there's enough stuff for 5 cars, where do you put that 5th car? Because you said every door has a name and a location, and these cars are dedicated to that location. How do you handle that 5th car?
I think that would be an unusual situation, except at Christmas time. And they've done enough Christmases, they know what to expect. But most of the cars didn't fill. And so they probably had a lot of extra capacity already built into their plans. But if you had 1 box too many, then you shut the door and you ship it on its way, and that extra box goes tomorrow.
I got another one for you. Okay. Based on a historical fact, there were a number of Buick automobiles that went into Las Vegas, Nevada in 1920. I think the newspaper said about 500 were being shipped.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be spread out all over the south end of Nevada. And I model a branch off of the LANSL, or the Union Pacific, in that era. And I know that they had a dealership down on the branch. So chart me a car on this one. It'd be coming out from Detroit on an auto, the LANSL and the UP both had a significant amount of auto boxcars. And my thought was, and this is where I'd like your opinion, that set of cars would go in, they'd all go to Vegas because that was a junction and had plenty of freight space. But then how would a smaller movement, let's say they want to deliver 4 of those Buicks to Overton, Nevada, which is off of a junction on the main line. So what would the car do? Would it be kept in that car in Vegas and then moved up? And then once it's done, it's an empty, because they're not going to put anything back into it on the branch. Would they send it directly at the junction point back to Detroit, or would it go back to Vegas and then to Detroit? If you can follow all of that.
Yeah. Well, I'm assuming this is an auto shipment, not an LCL shipment. In other words, the manufacturer is shipping from Michigan to a dealer.
Mm-hmm.
And so he ships those cars to the dealer. They're unloaded by the dealer. You've got an empty car now. And there were some cars at various eras that said return empty to the plant where they were built. And so it was rerouted and sent there. They would have all the racks and stuff inside to haul cars with. So I'm assuming it would just trace its steps back to Vegas and follow the same routing that it got there with.
Yeah, I'm thinking that it could be less than carload if, say, for instance, that box car comes down, that auto car comes down to Vegas, and most of the automobiles are going to be taken off in Vegas, but they could have, say, 2 of them that they want to continue on to the branch and take it down to the Buick dealership down there.
Then that would be a stop-off car.
Then you call it a stop-off. Okay.
Yeah, he would stop in Vegas. He would unload 2 of his cars, and then it would continue to the other dealer and unload the other 2.
Mm-hmm. And then the car would get back as best it could. It wouldn't have to go back.
Car would go back reverse route.
Reverse route would be the way it should go.
And chances are the car has a rack in it so that you can haul 4 automobiles. It probably had an Evans rack in it. So it's going to be routed back. Buicks go back to Flint. So it's going to go back to Flint, reverse route. That way, everybody that got a piece of the load, everybody that handled the load and get the tariff, they also have to handle the empty. That's part of the tariff. So it's reverse route. That's not LCL. It's they just combined. They combined 40 or 50 cars to go there, and then they're distributed. Now, if it's going on a branch line, chances are at the plant, that guy ordered 3 Buicks, so there's going to be 3 Buicks in that boxcar. When it's done, he'll unload his 3 Buicks and they'll come on back.
Right.
Yeah. Well, they had a drag that would go east every day from the junction point is Moapa, Nevada. And it could, I suppose, be sent back west to Las Vegas and put on the drag there, or it could be picked up and exclude Vegas on the return to Detroit.
Well, the whole idea about the tariff is you pay them for the load. You don't make a penny on the empty. And so since you shipped it full and get money there, you handle it back for nothing. So it's going back the reverse route so that the same people who made money on it lose money on it.
Right.
You want to put it that way.
Yeah. It's all part of the same railroad, though, all of that.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out whether or not routing west to Vegas, 70 miles back to Vegas, and then turning around to put it on the drag in Vegas, or just have it connect with the same drag it's going to be on heading east. That's what I was trying to determine there.
Yeah.
That would be railroad convenience. If feel it's convenient for them to do that, and it saves them a couple of bucks, they'll do that.
Right.
Shipper, it's the railroad convenience. But
the railroad will route the cars however they want to route them. It doesn't matter whether they could haul them. They could haul, if the railroad wanted to haul it all the way back to Los Angeles and put it on a train from Los Angeles to Chicago, they could do that. They probably wouldn't, but that's how they route it on their own railroad, is up to the railroad. That's a management decision.
Yeah, I'm just trying to solve this about how I would do it, whether we'd come back out and take because the only way I've been able to solve my branch, there's no documentation on this. I've being able to find out much about how it was handled down there. But the St. Thomas branch, it would go down with a turn and that turn would come out of Vegas and I'd return to Las Vegas same day. It's only a 21-mile branch, but the bigger question, I suppose, was just how I would route that empty coming back from the branch, whether I bother to take it back all the way to Vegas or just leave it there. So it looks like just as railroad convenience, I'm going to do what I've been doing, which is a car get dropped in Moapa and then just take the main line east.
All right. Well, I appreciate everybody hanging out for the after party here. We're going to go ahead and stop the recording. Steve, thanks again for presenting and sharing all of your knowledge about this this topic. We do appreciate it.
Thank you.
For everybody else, like I said, if you have something you want to present on, your next opportunity is in 2 weeks. It can either, if you've got something that'll go the whole hour, that's also optional. We can find you a date for that as well. So email editor@opsig.org or just eric@northcomp.com, and we can chat about what you want to present on. So in the meantime, have a good week, and thanks for attending.